Cool. So we are catching up now after a little bit of a hiatus for our show. Um,
Hey, for all anybody knows, it could be we just got done 5 minutes ago, and now we're on to the next show 5 minutes later.
that's
So
right. And I did see that Eric Bischoff took over with JR for an episode this week, I believe. Like he
really,
filled in for Conrad to be on Grilling with JR. And it was about um, Hogan, like the early days of WWF and WCW. It was just a fascinating little show. But Conrad is he has a pretty big stable or corporation of podcasts, and so Eric stood in for him with JR. It was incredible.
yeah. And Eric is a way better storyteller than people give him credit for. Ross too. When you get Jim Ross on the right subject, he can talk, 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 talk. You know what I mean? But yeah, diving into Hogan, that ought to be interesting, considering how I I get the feeling that Ross loves appreciates what Hogan did for the business. But he's very much pro wrestling. You know what I mean? And Hogan is not that. He is the antithesis of it. And Bischoff, as you know, has that close relationship with Hogan. Always has.
Yeah,
So but what's funny is Bischoff does, for as much as he is Hogan's friend and a supporter, he does talk unbiasedly about
yeah.
Hogan. You know what I mean? And is not afraid to, give the criticism where it's warranted. Does that
Yeah.
make sense? So
This was I know that Bischoff had kind of got his start in wrestling with Vern Gagne,
yep.
and he was able to kind of go into a little bit more detail, which that was really interesting to me because I didn't really know Bischoff until the very early days of WCW, moving into the soundstage at Universal, and so hearing his history on who introduced him to the business and who he learned it from uh, was pretty cool.
Did he share the Hulk Hoagie story?
The Hulk Hoagie?
Yeah.
I don't believe so.
Okay, so I will share that story because it's very publicized. It's publicized in Bischoff's book. I'm sure he's talked about it other places, but he had he was working as a salesman for a meat factory in Minnesota. One of his many jobs that he had before pro wrestling. A lot of them were sales though, because Bischoff was and still is to this day a master salesman.
Yep.
He and this was back when Hogan's AWA run was bubbling in 81, 82 ish time period, maybe 83. Bischoff, before he even got in the business, had the idea. He worked at this meat factory. He wanted Hogan to sponsor like grinder, like a hoagie sandwich. He wanted to call it a Hulk hoagie because he felt that putting Hulk's name on it could generate massive dollars, and probably at that time probably could have.
Back in the AWA?
Yeah, yeah, because Hogan was selling T-shirts in the AWA. Of course, that was a publicized dispute between him and Vern Gagne, where he went over to Japan and Vern sold the same
Yeah.
copies of his shirts. Didn't give Hogan any profits, so Hogan bounced. Well, it was one of his issues. So, anywho, but Bischoff wanted to pitch him the Hulk Hoagie, which I wonder how that would have went. That would have been one of Hulk's very early forays to merchandising.
Yeah.
Outside. So
Well, and merch was a whole different animal back then. Now there's a lot of guys. Their residual income from the business comes directly from merchandising, and so back then, I would imagine that concession stands are really the only place that you could find stuff like that.
yeah, yeah. In Memphis, guys, they took pictures, both 5x7s and 8x10s, and they called it picture money. That's how they made their extra money,
Ah,
top of supplementing the money that they were making from the actual business. You know what I mean, of pro wrestling.
yeah,
So at first it was pictures. Of course, the promoters kept the concessions at the concession stand or had a deal with the arenas or whatever, you know. But yeah, merchandising, it was around, but it wasn't mass marketed until Vince Jr. got into the game, because Vince Jr. was promoting stuff in Cape Cod, a minor league hockey team up in Cape Cod at the Cape Cod Civic Center. Also,
Oh,
he was on the off season. He was taking in concerts and saw how the concert business worked as far as shirt merchandise, shirts, pins, hats, you name it, that sort of merchandise. So, of course, Vince, being a student of the game, figured this part of the business out and kind of adapted it to where, and also Vince hired the best merchandisers he can find, and marketers, because while he had the ideas, of course he's going to hire people that are great at that job and pay them a shitload of money to keep them there. So
well, and that's how Coliseum Home Video started off as well.
yeah, yeah. Well, that started out as a failed deal, as I think I had said it on a previous episode, but Vestron Video,
Yep,
which
you have.
yeah, and that was a company based out of Connecticut, and Vestron actually went on to produce Ringmasters, which was like a highlight package of Great American Bash '85 or '86, I'm not sure which, and Lords of the Ring, which was world class, NWA, and a couple other promotions that were involved, like kind of as a collective group. They produced those two home videos, and they became very successful because they were riding the wave of what Vince Jr., and pro wrestling in general, they were just starting to go uphill.
The
You know,
Hogan era.
yes, promotion wise, and everybody was crazy about pro wrestling.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the Coliseum video came out of the deal came out of that, and the Coliseum video got the rights to WWF because they were such a young company for really next to nothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Man, it was successful for all parties involved, because think about it, in the video stores, what dominated those video shelves? It was Coliseum Video. All those big, I mean, I have them all behind me, all the big
I know.
holes and all that stuff. So
Yeah, that is not a green screen behind you. You have a very legitimate library of professional wrestling on VHS, DVD. It's
Ray, hard drive streaming,
yeah.
it's created a life of its own, as one would say. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I believe it was our when we were chatting about merchandise and media and things like that. Um, Thinking back to what were some of the mainstays on the shelves at Blockbuster or West Coast Video or Video. Those things are like permanently cemented in my mind as part of my childhood. Like, whoa, here is
Mine too. You rented one of those. It was a big deal to rent one of those, because again, those tapes behind me are heavy, so they were of good quality. They were meant to be played over and over and over and over again. I could still pop one in and it still plays. Like I just
yeah.
rented it today, from the video store, and I have a working VCR to do so. And which, it's funny because not a lot of people have one of those in their house anymore, but I certainly do. And just in case I get the itch, if I want to watch Hulkamania 2, I can watch Hulkamania 2, for example.
Yep.
Or what was it? Most unusual matches. That was a go-to for me for renting. We talked about gimmick matches last week,
Yeah.
and um, uh, man, and that one was it was basically a whole tape of gimmick matches hosted by Jesse Ventura. So yeah, one of the many videotapes that Jesse did not get paid for until he sued the
Yeah.
company years later and then got paid. So
Yeah. Well, and back then it really was a novelty to be able to watch something on demand whenever you wanted. You may have recorded something, recorded a pay per view or recorded a replay of an event, but having access to whatever you wanted whenever you wanted really was not around back then.
no, you had to be a very, very, very crafty tape trader, or knew how to dub tapes, which we both did. or just find alternative sources through or those early stages of tape trading, which I didn't get into until I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And or the companies like RF Video, thankfully, were around that had your ECWs and other stuff that like just nobody else had at the time.
What's
So
that place in Connecticut that sells rare or rarer music there? What's that? I can't remember the name of that place. I think
uh,
it's Enfield.
Music Outlet, I still shop there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I can remember going there as a early teenager. I went there with Tim a couple times, and yeah, just all of these things that I had seen in like catalogs or read about in magazines. It's like there it was, and that was just such a novelty to see things like that.
And to this day, I make the trek at least like once or twice a month to go down there. I'll spend a lot of money there once or twice a month, but I'll go down there once or twice a month because they have a great used section, they have a great vinyl section.
Yeah,
They have just a lot of stuff. Their used section is crazy good. Also, their import section is nice, and all the rare stuff that they get, box sets. I love going there just to find, because 9 times out of 10, well, first of all, you're supporting an independent music store, which I'm always in favor for. Secondly, I just like the thrill of going down there, shuffling through, and finding some gems that I wouldn't normally find. So
yeah,
I've always been that way with whether it's movies, whether it's music, whatever. Wrestling even too. I mean, you find wrestling in the weirdest places, really. So whether you go see it live, which I have, I've seen it in a church, I've seen it in parking lots, in other weird places that you would not normally see pro wrestling. And it goes without saying for even the merchandise, you see it just pop up in the most random places of all time, and you're just like, "Wow, this is here! All right,
yeah,
cool." And sometimes they don't know what they have, so but they know it sells because it's pro wrestling. So I ended up buying it, and I'll be like, wow, I just saved me a fortune,
yep.
That's on this rare VHS tape from 1987, whatever it is.
Well, and I was just checking because some of our earliest episodes, um, like the theme music one and the media and consumption one, um, being able to watch something on demand, like on a VHS tape, that has not been edited for history's sake or for copyright's sake.
Yeah.
Little things like there, like especially how big a wrestler's entrance music was to their persona, to their performance. I don't know, having that stuff kind of scrubbed and dubbed over does kind of take. I think it takes a lot of the shine off. To be
It
candid.
does, but you know what? Regular television isn't immune to it either. They change stuff around all the time. And regular, I just watched a video the other day about Disney things that are scrubbed from Disney Plus and
Yeah,
scrubbed. And like again, I mean, and that's to be expected. Disney is all about family friendly, and all that. That's to be completely expected. That they're gonna especially now with the acquisition of 20th Century Fox and
yeah,
those early Marvel movies, of course you're going to scrub some things, But again, that's why physical media is important because you get the unaltered version.
it's yours.
Yeah, you have it for the rest of your life. I have a not so good quality right next to me on my right. Can't see it from here, but it's a WrestleMania set unaltered, 1 through 13, which was available through Shop Zone. I don't even think they had the rights to release it at the time. They meaning WWE. It was a Shop Zone exclusive back then. But
Yeah, if you put all the tapes together, didn't it form a picture on like the side of it?
yep, it has. It's the WrestleMania. It's a playoff of the WrestleMania 12 logo. So
Yeah, I've seen that.
yeah, and that has every WrestleMania unaltered. The only downside to that is the fact that they're all recorded in EP mode. So they play average at best, which sucks because I think the only tape that really plays all the way through is WrestleMania 1, which is my one of my least favorites. It's
Yeah.
actually one of the WrestleManias I throw on to fall asleep. No offense. I get the historical significance of it, but to me, it's an overglorified house show, really. But it has the original Phil Collins "Easy Lover" intro. It has Hogan's "Eye of the Tiger" is on there. Girls Just Want to Have Fun with Wendy Richter coming out with Cyndi Lauper is on there. Born in the USA is on there for the U.S. Express. So it has things on there that you wouldn't see on the altered the really altered WrestleMania set years later, and
Yeah,
subsequent WrestleMania releases to follow. Yeah, whether it be streaming or other. The picture looks great. That's all I can probably about say about it. They cleaned up all those pictures well for digital.
yeah,
That I can commend them on, because that takes and that was part of what, when I went to school, broadcasting school, they taught you about that, and that takes time and hours and a lot of man hours to just to patiently sit through and frame by frame by frame fix everything.
Well, and I remember when WWF became WWE, um, they were going through and scrubbing the WWF logo from their entire library. And I
Yeah.
remember seeing a commercial that you didn't even have to be an employee, but if you wanted access to that, they were kind of handing that out to any fan who could do it, which at the time there were not as many. You could call up and apply, or email and apply. So you could go through the library and scrub those out. And I believe that those were permanent changes to what the source material for what they have right now. Because I see a lot of things on the network that still have that in there.
I mean, unless they just got lazy and left it because it was already digitized, they just left it up there, which I can tend to believe. You know what
Yeah,
I mean? Why why go back and unalter it again? You know what I mean?
yeah. Especially
Again,
since most of what they do now is just compilations and editing. Um, yeah, I think you're probably right that it's for laziness sake that they just don't want to go back and undo that.
a theory of mine, but again, no different if you're a Star Wars fan, George Lucas, or a fan of any of George Lucas's work. How many times has he gone back and re-edited his stuff over and over and over again, much to the fans' dismay, because
Yeah,
it's not the movie they remembered. You know, whether it was Indiana Jones, whether it was the Star Wars series, like, you're not going to please everyone, is what I'm saying. Like, it sucks on one hand, but on the other hand, you have the fact that there's this footage could be lost forever, like,
yeah,
so take your pick. You know what I mean? You can either see it halfway or you can not see it at all. So
yeah.
it's
And I
it,
do think for the most part, having everything right available on the network when it was on its own, or with Peacock, um, it allows for a lot of things that were most likely lost to history to just be there, and so you can see the essence of most things. But for me, and we have talked about this a couple times on our previous shows too, but um, a wrestler's theme music, or uh, their entrance, things that have been edited for most likely copyright's sake, the things that are really like I said, a big part of my childhood and my original experience with it are kind of lost. But on the other hand, there is really just no other way for this stuff to be readily available to a customer base. And so, like you said, it's better to see some of it than nothing at all.
right. And again, it could be just locked in the vaults forever. Never to be seen, never to be heard from again. Which does happen. And we speak of music. Music was a novelty too. We didn't have that readily available through our fingertips either. Having all these MP3s now uh, of music that
Yeah,
now WWE has released the Jim Johnson and Jimmy Hart vaults, where Jimmy Hart and JJ McGuire, all these vaults of music. We didn't have that back in the day. You had your wrestling album, Pile Driver 2, if you were lucky enough to have it, and then you had your Full Metals and Volume 1, 2, 3, or Volume 2, 3, 4, or whatever, and
And then you
wrestling.
had those little white cassette tapes that you could buy at a concession stand at a house show if you were lucky.
Right. Or if which had like 30 minutes of music back and forth and it wasn't the best of quality. Also, you got those through the fan club as well if
That's right, yeah.
you joined. So and they made several of those, but again, uh that wasn't always available either. And they're not all on there either. So meaning they're not all on streaming is what I'm saying because
Yeah.
of prices and all that stuff, you know. Like if you go on the streaming now and you try typing in the Forcible Entry album, which was one of their I think that was released through Columbia Records, that little mini deal that they had in the early 2000s, they only have probably about 5 tracks on Amazon Prime that are like available, and then the rest are, where are they? I don't know. You know, but that happens a lot with real musicians too, where they'll have a whole album and they'll leave off like 2 3 tracks
Yeah.
inexplicably. But it could be for weird reasons like publishing, or they don't want to pay a musician or something. Because again, it's a sub business. It's a sub business that we do not know about behind the
Yeah,
scenes.
for
So
sure.
it could be a number of things. But again, wrestling isn't immune to it. Neither is real media and real entertainment. It's not immune to it either. So and you'd be a fool to say, yeah, why? You know, like I can bitch and rage all day, but I'm not gonna. No, it's better.
We could do a whole episode on piracy.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's why it's led to piracy, is because you want that original content, you know. So I still have, speaking of which, wrestling wise, I still have all my original RF video shoot interviews from when I tape traded,
Yeah,
and they're all unaltered interviews with the unaltered footage, which wasn't supposed to be in there because they didn't even own it at the time.
yeah,
So, way other territories that now WWE owns. I know I'm never going to see that again. I'll see the interview part, but I'm not going to see the footage spliced in with that interview. I
yeah.
have, so, and I'm lucky to have it.
Well,
But
and it really wasn't until like the early to mid '90s where you started to. Uh, I imagine Napster was a big, uh, a big influence on what song a wrestler comes out to, what song uh, it gets played there, and then what happens once you have that recorded and you're selling it and you're streaming it for consumption. Um, that's a whole different ball of wax
yep,
back
that's
then
technology.
than it is now. Yeah,
Which ironically, Metallica has licensed like at least 3 songs to WWE that I can think of. One of them being the Enter Sandman to Sandman during One Night Stand, and they paid for it once. WWE did, and then they never used it again. Undertaker with the Boneyard match, same thing. Uh,
yeah,
I think they've gone back and changed it now in the or they altered it somewhat. You know what I mean? If it's not up there, but yeah, WWE doesn't. They'll pay for it once, but they're not going to pay for it consistently. So
yeah. All right. Today we are discussing gimmicks in the great world of professional wrestling and sports entertainment, and it's a word that has existed for it's been in the lexicon for a very long time,
yes,
um,
that.
and it's been applied to a whole lot of different things. Um, I've loved listening to you espousing like the Frank Gotch era of wrestling and coming into the more modern sense of it.
Yeah.
Um, when when did we start to see well, first, what is a gimmick when specifically when it applies to sports entertainment and pro wrestling, and when did we start to see those things as a mainstay of the product?
Well, that is a multi-part question because a gimmick could be it could be several different things to several different people in the world of pro wrestling, as we both know. A gimmick could be, you know, hey, you gimmicked your drink, or a gimmick could be, hey, that's a great get. But in terms of us talking about gimmicks, we're talking in reference to the wrestling character,
Yeah.
which the earliest known, I would say, was tailor made for television. It had to have been Gorgeous George, being one of the earliest, most successful gimmicks of pro wrestling, because Gorgeous George came out. He was very much a froofy guy with longer hair, curled, blonde, uh, threw out bobby pins and orchids, you know what I mean? Like orchid flower, like lays and stuff like that. And had an assistant, whether it was his wife or whether it was his manservant, spraying. This was like the early arrogance bottle
Yeah.
spray, and he would stop in the middle of the match. He had an oxygen tank, and it would say Hollywood Air on it. Bullshit. He would stop and breathe in the Hollywood air because he couldn't stand breathing in air of another town, So he
Yeah.
the guy just had the robes. I mean, the guy just had an influence. Gorgeous George Wagner had an influence on wrestling going forward that I think it wasn't until him that the modern era of pro wrestling existed, in my opinion, because I mean, Muhammad Ali has even come out in interviews years later and said he stole a lot from Gorgeous George, and
Wow.
for his promos and his his trash talking. So Muhammad Ali came out and said that was a big part of his character as far as him talking trash. So that's how influential that guy was, and it went generational. Where it got up to, I would say the modern day equivalent would be your Ric Flair.
Yeah.
In the last 30 years, because I mean Ric Flair has taken that gimmick, which Buddy Rogers, I think it was a combo of Gorgeous George and Buddy Rogers, which were both in the business at the same time, and just expounded upon that greatly. Ric
When
Flair made it his
when
own.
when did we see Gorgeous George, and where was he when uh these gimmicks and these kind of performances were uh uh, and first being done for a wrestling audience?
Okay, so Gorgeous George was very much a product, just like a lot of those 1950s, mid 50s, early 60s wrestlers were a product of the Dumont Network in Chicago, which was one of the first big networks to broadcast pro wrestling on a national scale, which then everybody knew who those gimmicks were. Um, so he was part of that wave of characters, along with Buddy Rogers, along with Lou Thesz, along with Pat O'Connor, along with Vern Gagne, a lot of guys who went back to their home territories after they made big money in Chicago, because then they were rented out throughout to other places around the country, loaned out, and they just made themselves a boatload of money. And basically, they made so much money, that wave of guys, that they all went home and started territories. So which was the norm. If you wanted to be in the pro wrestling business, and that's when the territory system, as we knew it, blossomed. It went from being kind of like we're gonna all work together and consolidate, to when these guys basically made their big money on television. They went back home, they bought in, or they just took over a promotion, and just things bloomed like a rose would bloom,
Yeah.
and that helped. And a lot of those were separate television deals through their specific markets too. It wasn't just limited. It wasn't just Chicago. Like Chicago had a bigger market, and still to this day, it's one of the biggest wrestling markets. But it was a big market back then. Broadcast
Yeah.
nation, so everyone saw it. But the difference was that class was looked at as kind of like movie stars. They,
Yeah.
they they transcended pro wrestling back then. Their gimmicks transcended pro wrestling. So when they went home, they were the biggest deal in their hometown. So with them being involved, them being that specific wrestler, they can sell television to all these various markets around their home area or other states that didn't particularly have pro wrestling, or they promoted. So
And
Uh,
so this kind of laid the framework for um, later on having a traveling champion who was known on TV and then rented out and booked for the local person. Is this where we start to see the early beginnings of that type of system?
well, I think that system had been in practice anyway. Like, okay, so when Buddy Rogers had it, they loaned he was loaned out to all these different territories. When Thez got it, and he was loaned out to a lot of the different territories. But after a while, Lou Thez didn't want to do it. So that's where when they made Vern Gagne at one period U.S. champion and had him travel the country, basically. Uh, He was world champion more or less, but just not by name. It
Yeah,
was He was doing all the dates that Thez didn't want to do, because Thez at some certain point, because he held the title 6 times, he became this position of power. Like he can say yay or nay to wherever he wanted to make his towns.
yeah. I
So
I think I remember you talking about this a little bit in our title belts episode as well, when they
yeah,
started to introduce secondary titles or alternative titles for somebody else to tour with.
and that particular version of the U.S. title, which Vern had, he um yeah, so he took that and just basically went around the country and became a humongous star. So by the time Vern Gagne went home to Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, he was he was as big as anybody else. And of course, he bought the Steckers out, and Tony Stecker, who he was trained by originally, and he had basically just bought in with Wally Carbo, and they formed the AWA, which was a very, very small promotion at first. But they made Vern their world heavyweight champion, because, of course, if Vern wasn't going to have it, the NWA politics, he was only going to be a secondary champion. Well, technically a world champion, just not by name.
Yeah,
He can go home, stay home, and have that status at home, and also get the rub of being that big television star that he was off the Dumont network, which a lot of those guys use that rub. I mean, when Gorgeous George went home, he went home to California, and that was the Olympic Auditorium. And Gorgeous George was he coasted off his name for years. He had a bar at one point, I do believe, and other various businesses in the California area. He was massive, and people like to downplay his popularity, but no, he was Hulk Hogan levels of popular. He was top dog. Everybody remembered Gorgeous George from that time period.
and so
So
he was the one of the first people to have a gimmick, a very worked character.
yeah, because well, he was a pretty decent pro wrestler, and he went by his real name, George Wagner. In the beginning with the dark hair, but it wasn't until he dyed the hair blonde, grew it out, and just started wearing the robes and just embellishing upon that character, that he became just massive. And then when he started really coming into his own with the character, bringing his wife into the act, bringing his manservant into the act, bringing all these different gimmicks into the act, it was just like he became bigger than life, which in the 1950s, nobody had ever seen anything like that before. This was black and white television. So
Yeah,
to pop, to really pop out in color on a black and white television, if that makes sense, which Gorgeous George was hitting all the sensory buttons on people's brains back in the 1950s that way, you had to be something special.
yeah.
He even starred in his own movie in Alias the Champ, which was in theaters. I have a bootleg copy of it, actually, but it was in theaters, and it was a pretty big deal, because he was one of the first pro wrestlers to star in a movie. Like, so it's uh, he and Macho Man took a lot of Randy Savage took a lot of inspiration from Gorgeous George, and as I explained in another episode, went and
Yeah.
bought the name Gorgeous George. So he was a big influence. So, and Savage, I mean, we talk about Flair stealing from Gorgeous George, but I think Savage may have stole the most from Gorgeous George in the most ways. I mean, it's the most obvious. Yeah, Miss Elizabeth. He had the big flashy robes. He wasn't a big guy. Gorgeous George Wagner wasn't a big guy either. He was probably 250 if he was lucky,
Yeah.
and Savage was probably 220 at his prime. So we're not talking years later when he became Bonesaw, and jacked in WCW in 98, 99 time period. That's Savage. No, we're talking WWF Savage and Memphis Savage, who was, he was a short guy, a small guy in stature compared to everyone else. So he had to stick out. And
Yeah.
he closely used Gorgeous George's inspiration. So
Yeah.
I'm going off on a tangent, but I'm trying to emphasize how important Gorgeous George was to pro wrestling going forward
Yeah.
from you know
And it was that Nature Boy style uh, gimmick, or a Hollywood style gimmick that was getting him known, as this elitist type character. Then,
yeah, and because Hollywood to this day it has a well, maybe it's lessened because of social media and access. Everyone has access to everything, but this was back during a time where Hollywood was considered a glamorous place to be, and it was this
it was very
enigma.
secretive too. You didn't have celebrities. You didn't have social media, but you didn't have celebrities really letting the general public in on what their lifestyles were. And
Right. And rock stars were no different in the in the 60s and 70s. Same thing. They weren't letting people in. Like, do you think Led Zeppelin was doing meet and greet selfies back then with their fans, charging $5,000 a pop? No, they
yeah,
were they were rock gods. Like, this was before a time of access. So these gimmicks burned in your brain, and they were bigger than life. And they maintained that for a good, I would say, 20, 30, 25, 30 years afterwards, uh, maybe until like the early 90s, maybe attitude era, like where fans started to get more access to the guys and girls,
yeah.
uh,
Who else, kind of coming out of the Gorgeous George uh, era, or even the promotion or the territory? Um, what were some of the other prominent gimmicks that guys would put together and have that got them a lot of notoriety?
all right. So we have Buddy Rogers, of course, being the original Nature Boy. That molded a lot of wrestlers too. That his style molded a lot of wrestlers to adapt to the same style. Ric Flair being the biggest example. He took it and just. I think he took elements. He took elements of a lot of people and kind of made it his own. Which Flair's documented himself. And it's true if you actually watch his work, and you're like, oh, that makes absolute sense. On another scale, we talked about, like, on previous episodes, like um hillbillies, like, meaning like the Kentuckians come to mind, which was Jake the Snake Roberts' dad was in the Kentuckians, Grizzly Smith. And that hillbilly gimmick was kind of an exaggerated, because especially if you're from up here, you have people up here in the Northeast that portray people who live down south as hillbillies. I am not one of them, but I'm saying
Yeah,
it happens. To this day, it still happens. So, and much like, where the South, same thing to us, where it's like, oh, you Northeasterners, you know what I mean? So it's a very contentious relationship, even though the Civil War ended so many years ago. Um, but you had the hillbillies, and they were portrayed as happy-go-lucky. McGuire
sympathies.
twins, yeah, McGuire twins were more of an attraction, but they were hillbillies as well. Any kind of hillbilly character you was kind of considered like. Well, the biggest example was Haystacks Calhoun.
Yeah,
Came years later, in the 60s and 70s. He was arguably the biggest star to come out of that gimmick range. But he, yeah, it set a bad precedent that continued on and on and on and on and on, where hillbillies were these hillbilly characters were in our minds Southern bumpkins, and they had no style of pro wrestling, even though some of them were pretty legit badass characters, like
Yeah.
Henry Godwin comes to mind years later, who
Yeah.
was a legitimate badass, cornbread strong kind of guy. Phineas too, um, uh, with Dennis Knight. So you had the hillbillies, you had guys in masks, which that goes back to the, I mean, Mexico. That's that's the culture. Santo and Blue Demon being the two biggest gimmicks there. Santo was Mexico's Hulk Hogan. So and Silver Mask, and both him and Blue Demon starred in movies over there, multiple movies. Later, Mil Mascaras comes along in the 60s and 70s, and Mil takes what he never became as big as Santo as far as that icon status in my mind, but he was, I would say, before Rey Mysterio, one of the most popular masks that was sold in Mexico was Mil Mascaras' mask, because he was known as the Man of 1,000 Masks.
Yeah.
So before Rey
And
Mysterio.
yeah, and that, from my understanding, at least at this time, that was very closely associated with uh, luchador wrestling, wrestlers from Mexico, and so coming up into the U.S. Um, I don't, from what I've read, I don't think um, the U.S. audience, especially probably back in this time, really appreciated why they would wear masks, the history of it, um, but they would adopt it because you can put a lot of different guys in a similar mask and then pass them off as somebody else.
And Memphis loved to do that. They would have the same worker portray like three different mass wrestlers on their show, or better, and have them work three times. Of course, they get paid for one time of working, the old promote. But yeah, the only two markets that got it were Texas, of course, and California. And why? Because there's a huge Mexican populace in both those states. So they're the only ones that got it. That's why when AAA came in the 90s, Conan's AAA promotion, or sorry, it was Pena's AAA promotion. Conan was the top star, and that came in the 90s. That sold out the LA Sports Arena back in 1994. Keep in mind that building probably holds 16 18,000 or whatever it is. Small building, by all standards, but
Yeah.
still they have a strong enough product to sell it out in 1994 when the business was on its ass. Like that there's something to be said about that. Like the people in California got it. So just like the people in Mexico, or sorry, not Mexico, in Texas get it too, because again, huge Mexican population. Think about it. Jose Lothario was a huge star in Southwest Championship Wrestling for a lot of years, or any other Texas territory. He was. Keep in mind, he wasn't under a mask, but still, he was one of the biggest stars they ever had. Houston, Southwest. Um, trying to think.
Well, just kind
Mill,
of from that area and part of that culture from that local area as well.
Chavo Senior too, same thing. He was a huge star. Alberto Del Rio's dad, Dos Caras Senior, who was a huge star. So you had guys that they made a blip in the U.S., but it was only on certain markets where their gimmicks really people really got it. Memphis was see, and we go back to Memphis all the time. Well, I do anyway. But really, they were talk about a promotion that was just laden with gimmicks. They had more gimmicks than somebody can throw a stick at, really. And they were never afraid to try things in Memphis, gimmick wise. They goofy, no matter serious, anything. They went there, and you watch the old footage. If you can get your hands on it, it's prevalent. So
When did the uh, the gimmick become a part of a guy's training when he's getting smartened up to the business. Um, when did you start to see, hey, here's a little peek behind the curtain, but you're going to have to be good on the mic. You're going to have to be good portraying this. When does that become a mainstay in training to be a pro wrestler?
Well, see, back then, a lot of guys, a lot of the gimmicks were stuff that just guys came up with, or guys were in a car on the road, or they would just brainstorm ideas and come up with things. Um, Having like a solid gimmick, a lot of those gimmicks came naturally. Like a good example is oh, man, what was it? Don Fargo, I want to say. Yeah, it was Don Fargo. He was known as the man of 1,000 gimmicks. He was in a biker gang for a brief piece, so of course he portrays a biker gimmick at one point because that's what he was in real life. He was associated with the Hell's Angels in real life, so he brought that in the pro wrestling. Like for example,
Art
then you,
imitating life?
yeah, you okay, so I don't think it was like because think about it when Flair got trained to be a pro wrestler, for example, by Vern, right? He wanted to be a gimmick. He thought of his gimmick as being the next Dusty Rhodes, which he was coming up with his own gimmick as Ric Flair. Uh, I don't think it was in his psyche to come up with that Nature Boy gimmick until years later. Because if you think about it, the early versions of Flair were a ripoff of Dusty or a ripoff at the time of Superstar Billy Graham, which that was a gimmick that was just completely ripped off by a lot of people. So and we're talking maybe 5 years until Flair came up with the whole, which actually wasn't his idea; it was George Scott's idea, the Booker. But Flair had to execute the gimmick, was what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
it was his ideas to come up with the robes and all that stuff. So that didn't come until years later, really. So it really is on a like on the early stages of pro wrestling. I don't think guys, they were just trying to get in. They weren't like, you know what I mean? Like the smarter wrestlers would figure it out. Like Jimmy Garvin had said, for example, he knew he wasn't a big guy. He was probably 219 at best, right? And he said because he knew he wasn't a big guy, again, he took inspiration from Gorgeous George. He had to dress up himself as a gimmick because he had the skills of a good amateur wrestler, but that wasn't enough to get the mainstream eyes looking at you. So he had to come up with this over the top gimmick. Hence, Gorgeous Jimmy Garvin was born. So again, it was more of the wrestlers' thought process than the promoters. Um, I
Because
mean,
enhancement talent back then, um, jobbers or whatever you want to call it, the the way the business was structured and operated was pretty different from today. If you wanted to be a top guy there, then you had to put in you had to pay your dues, you had to put time in. When you say that it was kind of more up to the guys, how would that work if you're working for a promoter and they're starting to see what um, you can do? Uh, do you know of anybody that put together a gimmick but kind of had it squashed, to steal another term, um, because the guys in that area were either already doing it or it would interfere with how they were programmed? When do we start to see really outrageous gimmicks, and how did those work going from like one territory to another?
all right, this is a good question, and we're gonna go back to old reliable here, Memphis. And I'll tell you why. We had the fabulous ones, which were invented. They were managed by fabulous Jackie Fargo, who was a very popular wrestler in Memphis. Had his own gimmick going on. Actually, he was the guy who first, where Jerry Lawler stole it from, took down the straps, which meant business. You know what I mean? Jerry
Yeah.
Lawler completely stole it from him. Fargo Strut, Jeff Jarrett stole that from him. Uh, uh, they had claimed it was Buddy Rogers, or some would say it was Ric Flair. Jeff Jarrett has said it himself. He stole it from Jackie Fargo, and I tend to believe it because he grew up on Memphis wrestling, right? So, anywho, you had the Fabulous Ones that come out, right? And they were popular in Memphis. Now, Rock and Roll Express is formed, right? And in Memphis, they did good business, but they didn't do great business. They didn't monster business like they did in Crockett Promotions or when they moved. Now, when Bill Watts comes in and does the talent trade with Jerry Jarrett, he ends up acquiring the Rock and Roll Express and Cornette and the Midnight Express, which were not a team yet. But my point being is Rock and Roll Express comes into Mid South and they just are beyond popular, like 10 times more. They're seen as like the first of their kind down in that territory, which lends to what I'm going to say next happen. Whether you're an enhancement guy, whether you're a guy with a gimmick, again, it's you were able to go from territory to territory back then. So if something didn't work out 6 months over here, maybe you can hit pay dirt down here, and your gimmick works. That's what happened with the Rock and Roll Express. So by the time they went to the Crockett promotion in '85, or yeah, it was '85, they went. So by the time they go, they already had a built-in audience, and they just took off like gangbusters there. And it was one of the few times where the imitation, slight imitation, I should say, of the Fabulous Ones actually became bigger than the Fabulous Ones ever did, ever did. So, because the Fabulous Ones are considered the innovators in Memphis, right? For
Yeah.
tag teams, gimmicks, and all that stuff. So, the Rock and Roll Express go to Crockett, and I mean, yeah, it was Dusty's booking too, but you know, man, they took off like gangbusters out there. You know,
So we're
um,
talking really, really early '80s, right?
we're talking like mid '85.
Okay.
1986, they were voted. Not only were they the tag champs, they were voted the most popular tag team in pro wrestling. Period. And they were, you know, like, and they were the innovators because you know after them came the Midnight Rockers, you know, which were essentially a ripoff, and Shawn Michaels being in Mid South at the same time as an enhancement guy, the same time as the Rock and Roll Express. Shawn Michaels goes to Minnesota. He is no longer an enhancement guy. He's teamed up with Marty Jannetty, and
Yeah.
they take off like gangbusters up in Minnesota. So what I'm saying is, it was up to a lot of it was up to the talent back then, of course. You know, booking had a lot to do with it too. You know, whether you're kept good or you're kept in the jobber status, you know, buried, whatever. But a lot of the ideas came from the guys. There was no writers back then. Uh,
Yeah.
the the booker had a general idea of where storylines were going, like, and how we're going to get to point A to point B. You know, like from month to month, week to week, show to show, whatever it was. You know, so um, man, this is a convoluted question, but
I know, and I don't think I really phrased it great either. Um, when so when that started happening, um, yeah, you guys didn't have the copyright to their own character, and if they weren't getting over here, but if this was working over there, they could take it, go to a different promotion or to a different territory, and kind of get over with that. How was that viewed uh, in the business? You know, either from the promoters or from the boys. Um, what was there anything kind of set up to stop that? Would wrestlers get blackballed or
the wrestlers still got blackballed back then. Trust me. But there wasn't. That was the beauty of the territories, your ability to take it to another territory. And again, who is the promoter going to sue? Another promoter or the wrestler itself? I mean, really, the way they would do it was they would just stop booking the guy, and of course, you were getting paid per appearance, per booking, or whatever, and you would starve to death, so you'd have to move. You
yeah,
know, so they were they operated, they meaning promoters, some of them operated a little more spiteful, you know, like towards that sort of end back then. um I don't think they were too concerned with copyrights or guys taking the gimmicks somewhere else. That didn't all really happen until Hulk and those guys. Well, Hulk was taken from Vern, and Vince basically took what Vern did because Vern did all the work. Hulk executed it, of course, the character, and they rode that momentum with Rocky 3, being the big promotion at the time for Hulk. But really, Vern did all the work as far as the booking and the marketing of the monster known as Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
All he had to do was just take it and go to Vince, and Vince just took it and embellished it way more. Now, but that stuck in Vern's craw only because it wasn't like Hulk was just another gimmick. Hulk was in all the main events. He was a cash cow for the AWA. So that was more what stuck in Vern's craw than anything. It wasn't the fact that he took the gimmick with him, because he would have sued Vince over it if he did,
Yeah.
right? So,
Well,
and
and
the Hulk Hogan name came from Vince Senior. So, really, who are you going to sue?
yeah. um, Thinking back to when we were kids watching this stuff, um, there was a lot of inspiration. Like I think of Demolition and the Road Warriors. Me having absolutely no exposure to anything outside of the WWF. Um, I also do think that Demolition uh, got over on their own merit as well. You know, they were definitely inspired from the Road Warriors, like there. But um, aside, so like aside from them, and I'm thinking of like the tag teams you were talking about, like the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Rockers. Um, what were some of the more egregious uh, copy paste gimmicks that was going on around this time, like the mid to late 80s?
Meaning like takeoffs of somebody else,
Yeah,
somebody else's gimmick.
yeah.
Well,
Where
we
it was maybe uh, kind of blatant, like I don't know.
we talked Rockers, which they became the Rockers from the Midnight Rockers to the Rockers, which that was a blatant ripoff. Everyone knows of the Rock and Roll Express, but they made it their own. So
Yeah,
where they're still very fondly remembered, much like Demolition. Same with them being a ripoff initially of the Road Warriors, but they were way different,
yeah.
and they made it their own. Of course, we talk Road Warriors. We could sit here for an hour and talk how many teams the Road Warriors inspired, really. But so I won't talk about that, but I will talk about like say let's see, um, where Vince took it. Okay, so you had for example, you had the Sheep Herders, right, with the
Yeah.
Bushwhackers, a very popular tag team. On WCW's side, I remember they brought in, they had Rip Morgan and Jack Victory as the New Zealand militia, which was not as successful as, say, the. Even though at a brief piece, Jack Victory and Rip Morgan both were flag bearers for the sheep herders in the different territories.
Huh.
NWA otherwise, right? UWF, whatever. But it's funny how that like one gimmick works successfully and the other gimmick just kind of, you know,
Where
doesn't
they're
work.
more cheap imitations than.
And that's not to discredit Jack Victory or Rip Morgan at all. They were great workers in their own right. It's just, you had that example right there. Both teams are from New Zealand, but one of these things is not like the other, Um, you had you've always had guys in masks. You had the I remember you had the conquistadors in the WWF, right? We both know that they were both Spanish guys, Spanish jobber guys under the masks, and they became something else. You know what I mean? So they had in WCW, they've had what was it? They had, I think, I want to say they were either the Gladiators or the Thunderfoots. I want to say they were kind of like a conquistador-ish gimmick, and they didn't work out as well. Um, No. You had trying to think of what else. Captain Mike Rotunda as a boat captain, not a varsity captain like he was in the varsity club.
Oh,
Uh,
I didn't know that.
but you have also him. He's a good example because you had Michael Wall Street in WCW, and then he goes to WWF. He's IRS. It's simply the same gimmick, except Vince took it and made it more hateable. You
Yeah,
know, because who doesn't hate doing their taxes every year? So
yeah.
it's a
See,
pain in the ass.
yeah, this is where I was trying to get us because you have people who would get over. Like Dusty Rhodes is probably one of the most um, well-known instances where he had a solid gimmick, a character. He was, uh, a great performer. He was his own product, and Vince would always let guys come in, no matter how big or small they were, and there'd be little tidbits of who they were, but they had to become something different for him.
Yeah. And Dusty wore and we talked about this. He wore the polka dots, and the Dusty being Dusty, he got it over, and that is one of the most popular, most remembered gimmicks from that time period. Also, Rugged Ronnie Garvin. He's another good example. He's known as Rugged Ronnie Garvin in the WWF. They scrubbed basically everything that he had just done years previous. He was the NWA World Champion, for God's sakes.
Yeah,
You know, one of the last of the old carryover NWA, like the territory NWA, right? If there was any left. I mean, by 1987, it may have been just Jimmy Crockett, but that meant something. He had the big gold. He was known as in NWA the man with the hands of stone, Ron Garvin.
yeah,
And they would put emphasis on Ron Garvin. They wouldn't call him Ronnie. They'd call him Ron Garvin, the man with the hands of stone, which that sounds a little more menacing, right? So uh, he comes in. He's known as Rugged Ronnie Garvin, and of course, up in the Northeast, yeah, he's a little bit better than a jobber, like better than the enhancement talent. But he was almost treated as such too. He wasn't what he was in the NWA as this top contender. Because the South and the North are completely different.
yeah.
You know,
He was very solidly booked for the mid card.
and another great example is, and now I've been watching old footage of it. Is you can find it on YouTube too. Barry Horowitz. He went by the name of Jack Hart in Florida, and Hart HART. It's a
Oh,
playoff of. So I do believe I think he's the product of the dungeon as well, Barry Horowitz. So I think that's why he used the Hart last name. Um, so he's an honorary Hart basically, but uh, he was known as Jack Hart down in Florida, and he was considered a contender there, and comes up to WWF and does some jobs in WCW, and he's
yeah.
perpetually he's like the job guy to the stars, basically. Like you give you a competitive match, he can give a competitive match with anybody, but he was never going to reach the imaginary glass ceiling that was Barry Horowitz, not until much later in the 90s when Vince was a little more open to ideas, because they were grasping for straws at that point.
Well,
So,
and like I think of him, the Brooklyn Brawler,
yeah.
um, jobbers to the stars, like you said,
And
and that
Brawler
kind of
by Heenan, you know,
what's that?
Brawler was managed by Heenan for a piece. So,
He was?
yes, he was in that brief 1989 time period. He was managed by Bobby Heenan
Was he
because
known as the Brooklyn Brawler?
he went. Okay, I'm glad you mentioned this. He went being Steve Lombardi, regular jobber, right? Jobber to the stars, basically in the vein of like your Iron Mike Sharps and your Barry Horowitz of the world. All of a sudden, they dressed him up as this gimmick called the Brooklyn Brawler to feud specifically with another gimmick, the Red Rooster, Terry Taylor, on behalf of Bobby,
Yeah,
because Bobby Heenan suddenly became Brooklyn Brawler's manager at some point. So, and of course, it didn't last very long, and he was never
yeah,
a true member of the Heenan family, but he could kind of put that as a notch on his belt by saying he was, because he was. I mean, Bobby Heenan was hot in 1989, so as a
Yeah,
manager.
the Heenan family was a premier stable in the
Yeah,
WWF.
yeah. 1989 was probably 1990 time period. I'd say 88, 89, 90. They were probably at their peak as far as strong faction.
Yeah. Um,
So,
when we get into the later years of the Hogan era, going into the new generation. Um,
oh man,
yeah, I've been trying to.
aim a dart.
Yeah, I've been trying to get us here because I think this is where pro wrestling gimmicks start to become just such uh, a mainstay in the business. Like, you couldn't just go out there and even like, as unless you were there to be squashed by somebody, but you had to have something novel about you and your character.
I,
um
I'm very happy to. I'm going to talk about both sides, by the way.
mhm.
WCW is not immune to this conversation because
They
this was
sure aren't.
because this was Jim Herd era, going into Kip Fry, going into Bill Watts, going into Eric Bischoff era. So we're going to be talking some gimmicks here.
Yeah. um yeah, so late 80s, early 90s. Vince is clearly the one that has started to put together these guys as over the top, very Hollywood-esque, and not a uh, grungy brawler, in a dim lit ring. Um, what were some people like Terry Taylor, the Red Rooster? What were some gimmicks that have come to be known as killing guys' careers, that they either got typecast or just stuck as these things, and that was just it for the rest of their time in the business?
Glaring one right off the top of my head: Rip Oliver as the Ninja. They bring him in for one match on Saturday Night's Main Event against the Ultimate Warrior. And from that point on, okay, so he leaves a successful territory in Oregon promotion, the Portland, Oregon, Don Owen promotion. He was the booker and the top guy there, right? Leaves for the lure of WWF because, of course, WWF is going off like gangbusters, 88, 89. Leaves, comes a Super Ninja for one match, and then Vince cuts him loose, and then he tries going back to Portland, and his spot was taken. You know what I mean? He was never the same when he went back. Still a big name up there, but he was never the same. So you have that as a good example. Terry Taylor, he still hates the Red Rooster. We mentioned that in previous episodes. No matter what he says, I mean, maybe he's come to peace with it now, maybe not, but
It just wasn't working, and he
and
was never able to come back from that either.
Uh, I mentioned I mentioned Ronnie Garvin as Rugged Ronnie. Let's see. There, see, but they're okay. So, by all accounts, the Mountie should have failed, but didn't because the performer Jacques Rougeau and his ability to get heat. I think that was a great gimmick.
Made
Horrible.
chicken salad out of chicken shit.
Yes. Good example. We just talked to Heenan family when Bobby Heenan was replaced with the coach as Mr. Perfect's manager.
Yeah.
What the hell was that? What was that? Like, again, John Tolos, big name in the California area. If you were lucky enough to remember him as the Golden Greek back in the 1960s or whatever it was, but nobody remembers him. He's coming back as a coach 30 years later. No. And I understand he had been on Herb Abrams' show as a character, previous, and that was broadcast on Sports Channel and other places, ESPN2 later. But again, why? Why was that even constructed? You know what I mean? Why? That never got over with anybody. Um, Trying to think of what else.
Well, and my mind keeps going back to guys who were wildly successful outside of the WWF, but getting there and again, sometimes just completely repackaging them or letting them keep a little bit of their character or personality, like the Road Warriors and the Legion of Doom. you know, I keep going back to them because they were the
How can
greatest
you
tag team ever. But
Yeah, how can you not? But again, both the Road Warrior name and the Legion of Doom name were both their ideas. So, but for some reason, they couldn't use the Road Warriors at the time in the WWF in that period of 1990, 1991. So they
yeah,
came up. Well, they had they were called the Legion of Doom as like a nickname. They got that from Super Friends.
mm,
Not E-Man. They got that from Super Friends. The Attack on the Legion of Doom. You can go look it up. I have the
yep,
DVD. But they got that from Super Friends. But you know what? If it's spun another way, that fits them to the T of that early '90s WWF, and that was very successful merchandise wise.
yeah,
Price their merchandise took off like gangbusters. Once Vince got the machine behind them, they Demolition were huge for that little time period,
yeah.
but God, the Road Warriors just dwarfed them as far as sales. I mean, I can't imagine how many millions of dollars are made off them over the years.
Well,
Uh,
and when you look at like merchandising, sometimes you just had to accept the best that was available. Me being a big belt mark, the little foam belts were, really cool and great, but didn't always quite line up to how they looked. But those foam shoulder pads with the spikes were just, those were so cool to me. Like little Chad was seeing that, and that was just the greatest thing.
Genius. They were and they sold. They were only like 10, $15 per back then. Now they're about $300 worth per if you go on the secondary eBay market with them. But yeah, they were successful as hell because they were marketed to little kids. This apocalyptic gimmick was marketed to kids, and it was cool.
Yeah.
Uh, so you had that. I'm trying to think. We're talking 1992. We're talking. Okay, you had Damien Demento. You remember him?
Yes.
Guy who basically heard voices and talked to himself in the ring. I mean, really, Ultimate Warrior had done that years previous and had done it way better. so, um,
I
but that's just one facet of his gimmick. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
And
Uh,
and so we've kind of just touched a little bit on where guys may have made it big outside of the WWF, but they get there to work with Vince, and um, were the polka dots a rib on Dusty? Maybe. Um,
yes.
was naming the Million Dollar Man's manservant Virgil a poke at Dusty? Likely. Maybe. Before we start looking at the Jim Herd WCW stuff, what's the other side of that? Where have some guys maybe not been successful otherwise, or started off, just the jobbing and getting squashed, and then found a gimmick either by happenstance or by design that around this time period really allowed their career to take off?
Um. Okay. So I was going to go back even further to that mid '80s period where they
Okay.
had that talent trade to the Rock and Roll Express.
Yeah.
Part of that talent trade was from Mid South to Memphis, Ravishing Rick Rude, a very young, very green Ravishing Rick Rude with no gimmick. In fact, his real name Rood, Rude, right? So
And he was not ravishing at this time.
no, not even close. But he's able to develop his character in Memphis. Comes out to the song "Smooth Operator" by Sade, which was perfect, and has the robe, has the hair, and basically creates the ravishing Rick Rude as we know it that he took to other territories, being Crockett, being WWF, that we know and love. That Rick Rude character was developed from that time. It didn't start that way. He was a horrible green wrestler who was just doing jobs,
Yeah.
basically. But he was part of that Minnesota crew, that tough guy, that early Minnesota crew. Your um, Beverly Brothers, your Scott Norton, your
Kurt Hennig.
Kurt Hennig, Barry Darso, those Berserker, John Nord, all those characters. So, well, okay, so we're talking gimmicks that worked in territories that didn't translate to WWF or WCW.
Well, just something that the gimmick was what allowed them to really kind of cement who they were in the business.
Yep.
And I know, and we're probably going to talk a lot about Barry Darso here in a minute, but it's just kind of like the opposite of where uh, they were known as something somewhere else outside of Vince's promotion. Came there, Terry Taylor. What would be the inverse of that? To where they somebody had to create a gimmick or be given a gimmick that just got their career in motion. Maybe not necessarily from one promotion or another.
Okay. Okay. I get where you're going. Scott Hall being a big example. No, basically he was the second coming of Magnum TA in a lot of promotions, right? He was a poor man's Magnum TA, right?
He was huge, just
Huge, blonde
huge.
hair, huge mustache. Looked like $1 million, but for some reason he had multiple stints both in NWA and in Florida promotions with no success whatsoever.
Yeah,
Finally, Diamond Dallas Page convinces him to cut the mustache off, grow the stubble, and dye the hair black, and come up with a move set that's probably limited to about 5, 6 moves, and Razor Ramon, that character, but at first known as the Diamond Stud, is born. So you have it's funny because here is this guy who's worked for what 5, 6, 7 years. He had a little success in the AWA, but that was a different type of promotion, that was more accepting to like cowboy type characters. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like besides that, he had very little success elsewhere until worldwide success until he developed his gimmick, which he developed in WCW, but Vince took it and with Razor Ramon and took it to a whole nother level in WWF.
yeah,
And embellished it and synthesized it to where it was his. So, and then he was able to take it back with him to WCW. Uh,
yeah. But I mean, even taking a look at him, um, with like his hair and that mustache and just being jacked beyond belief. Like he's one of those people where I look at those older pictures and I have to wonder for a second if that's really the same guy.
right, and you also wonder, it's like how the hell, I'm trying to figure out like how a guy like Magnum would get over, but a guy like Scott Hall wouldn't, and maybe he was just missing something, interview wise or character wise, something was missing, and that was not letting him go past a certain level.
Yeah.
There was another guy named DJ Peterson who was kind of in the same boat as Scott Hall. He died in an automobile accident
Oh,
early on, like probably like late 80s, early 90s, I want to say. But he was another one who was a pretty decent sized star in Minnesota, very similar looking to Scott Hall, but he never made it to like you know what I mean? He could never make it past just that AWA, that little bit of AWA fame that he had. He could never make it past it. Del Wilkes, another good example where he was known as the Trooper everywhere, made it famous in AWA, but something wasn't clicking. So he goes down to Global Wrestling and they create this whole new character for him called the Patriot. And he just runs with it and takes off because Del had a great body, but much like Mil Mascaris, he benefited from having the mask on.
did he
'Cause
have the mask early on though, before the Patriot?
no, he was known as the Trooper. He was unmasked. He had a mullet, at the time, and he was playing a state trooper, basically, kind of
Oh,
like a play off of like a Sergeant Slaughter type character, right? Which we haven't even talked about him and his transcendence in pro wrestling. I mean, my God, Slaughter. How many years has Sergeant Slaughter survived pro wrestling by being a big name? And he's a mainstream name. And
G.I. Joe, a real American hero.
right, think about it. He was the only living GI Joe until those movies came out. So, and Sarge, and we talked merchandise earlier. He was one of the big. That was one of the big blowups with him and Vince early on was the LJN thing, right? And
Yeah.
Sarge signs with Hasbro and becomes bigger than life outside of Vince. So And he was able to make so much money that he basically just did wrestling as kind of like a side job.
Yeah.
So he was getting paid so much from Hasbro and GI Joe. So
Would and kind of thinking of Scott Hall as well. Is it fair to say, channeling my inner Conrad now, is it fair to say that Vince and the early '90s New Generation type WWF was really the time and the place that kind of steamrolled what a gimmick is now very commonly known in wrestling with somebody. I know there's if you were a trade or if you were a dumpster, Duke the Dumpster Drosy on the Trash Man, it was this time that really kind of pulled the business away from those old, very kind of one-dimensional characters that might have gotten over in a bingo hall somewhere. But now you need to have something to make it. You can't just be the exception of Goldberg. You can't just be this one-dimensional thing. You need to have this gimmick, this novelty to you. Is it fair to say that the new generation era in Vince is responsible for how would that change the business really?
Uh, yeah, but WCW has to take some blame on it too because they were just as bad. Because think about it, where all the Duke the Dumpster Drosies and the Goons and all those people lived, Mantars, all those gimmicks lived at some point. On the other side, you had the Dungeon of Doom, you know,
Yeah.
that was bad. You had what was it, Ice Train, which was equally as bad. You had
Fire
uh,
and Ice were legit.
yeah. And they were great. I mean, for what they were a good tag team, but they weren't anything to write home about at the end of the day. Ultimately, I
Yeah.
love Scott Norton. I can't wait to meet him in Charlotte in next month. But that and he's always been one of my favorites to watch. And I'm always impressed by his arm wrestling. You know, because he's a legit arm wrestler and
Yeah.
tough guy. But yeah, something about Fire and Ice for me didn't work. Um, well, I'm trying to think of what else WCW had. They had Mortis and Wrath,
I
which
loved that tag team.
yeah, and they were great. Like I love the Mortis character. It was awesome for Chris Canyon to put on the mask, and because again, the mask benefited him more than him being unmasked. But uh, that just added something to him. But again, he was never. That was during when NWO was running like gangbusters, and there was no way something like that was going to get over past the NWO. Not to a certain level, that is. You
Yeah.
know,
Um,
and uh, I'm trying to think.
well,
Occupational, like, okay, so we're gonna go to the Jim Herd era, right? You had his big
yeah.
coup was getting TJ Strongbow's son, who also worked for WWF at a certain point. His name was Mark Young in WWF. He was a breakdancing kid with American striped tights. I have no idea what this gimmick was, but for some reason they tried it in WWF, it failed. They tried it in NWA, it failed also. So I don't know what the purpose of that was. B, Ding Dongs. Another mass tag team, kind of a takeoff of Conquistadors, except they had bells all over them. Two job guys underneath the masks, and it was awful, awful. From Bellevue, Illinois, I believe they were from.
That's
Which
terrible.
was awful. Brad Armstrong gets rechristened the Candyman Brad Armstrong because they have a deal with M&M Mars at the time. Just for no reason, Brad Armstrong wears Candyman tights. You know, um, just like a year later, for no reason, Brad Armstrong becomes Bad Street in the Bad Street USA crew under a mask, and Arachnaman, which got pulled very quickly because Marvel sued them. So
Yeah.
Arachnaman looked too much like another web superhero. Poor
um,
Brad. And he was another guy, talented as hell, had the body, Brad Armstrong was legit one of the more, besides the old man, I'd say Brad Armstrong was probably the best in the ring out of all the Armstrongs, right?
Mm.
Just got dealt a shitty hand as far as gimmicks and everything else is concerned. Now, Road Dogg, on the other hand, that is a different story completely. You know what I mean? He
Yeah.
found a gimmick that worked and rode it, but Brad, not so much. So,
In this time in WCW with Jim Herd, um, Hulk Hogan hasn't quite shown up yet, but you start to see just the idea of turning Ric Flair into Spartacus really kind of baffles the mind. But um,
yeah.
I think of like the little mini movies, Spin the Wheel, Make the Deal, A White Castle of Fear, having RoboCop at a event. Um, this is kind of the absurd
Oh,
era of WCW, is it? Isn't it?
yeah. The RoboCop thing was heard. But the other two were actually Kip Fry. They kind of went into the Bill Watts era, but they were produced by Sharon Stiletto, who produced those two mini movies. Actually, all the mini movies that WCW ever did, which were ridiculous. Um, RoboCop was Herd's idea, and that was the cross promote with RoboCop 2, which I don't know if it did. If RoboCop 2 didn't need any cross promotion at that point, you know what I mean? And I don't think it did WCW a lick of good having him on the pay per view. And the suit looked like it was about to fall apart. It was hokey. It was not good.
Yeah.
Uh, like
Why
RoboCop
did we start to see these things in WCW though?
cross promote Jim Herd's attempt of trying to cross promote, just like with the Ruse shoes, if you remember those at all. They were shoes that had pockets on them with zippers, like, and
Oh yeah.
they were awful. But I had a couple pairs over the years. I did, along with LA Gear. Remember LA Gear was big at that point. I had
Yeah.
those. Um,
I had a windbreaker. It was purple.
yeah, yeah. But it was Herd's attempt to try to cross promote, because he saw what Vince was doing and he was trying to get in on the game. Vince was a way better merchant. He had way better people on his staff that could merchandise ideas, because he paid some of the best people in the world to do it. But and Vince got all that cross promotion from all these different areas because he just did it better. Had better, and I think a lot of that had to do with. I mean, first and foremost, it started with production because Vince had a better production going for himself at every point in time, even during the shitty times, than WCW ever did. Because
Mm.
WCW was a conglomerate of Turner Television, so you had the wrestling people who knew wrestling, but you had Turner people who didn't know wrestling. They were there, and basically as spare parts. So they're operating as like kind of like a vehicle with three wheels,
Yeah.
Turner is. So and then you had Herd who thought he was a genius and was watching what Vince was doing and thought he could do it way better. But no, they're missing the point. Herd and it never got any besides the people ordering the pay per view, it never got any extra eyes on the product at all. Just like the Ruse thing never got any extra eyes on the product at all. The Zubaz thing worked because the Road Warriors, that was their own separate deal, and they were legitimately part of it. And Dan Marino was part of that deal as well. That was their other partner, along with the other two original guys who started it. So that was a separate deal entirely with the Road Warriors. So the Road Warriors made a lot of money, but WCW did not. So, but that was the difference between them and Vince, where Vince would come in and kind of say, okay, I'll lend out this wrestler to you, but I get a percentage of the deal. Which he was a way smarter businessman in doing that. Or because if it were Vince marketing the Zubaz, he would have been like, yeah, I'm gonna get my piece as well. That's where Vince was way smarter than a lot of other people. You know,
Royalties and residual income from deals like that.
he knew how all that worked, and if he didn't know how it worked, he hired somebody to get to know how it worked. So Vince was ahead of the game on a lot of shit like that. And why you saw that was really it was keeping up with the Joneses. Same reason as if you go back to WCW at their time, what was NWA known as besides their big slogan was "We wrestle" back then, right? But they also had some characters that did the best promos. You know, you had your Flairs, your Dusties, the Road Warriors, the Rock and Roll. They all did great promos as well to pull you in, right? So they pull you in with the promos, they get you with the wrestling. So and that's sold. Well, when Jim Herd comes in, he didn't believe in promos because he the only wrestling he saw was in St. Louis, who did no promos. If you ever watch footage of St. Louis, there's no promos whatsoever. It's just straight wrestling. So he saw what Vince was doing with the pre-tapes, so he would have these guys do pre-tapes. All these great interviews, Ric Flair, Sting, Luke. Well, Luger was questionable back then, but he had his own style. You know, you get the picture. All these great promo guys are doing canned promos now.
Yeah.
So, and they were just inserting them anywhere. That didn't really work. You know, like Vince could do it because he did it in a style that where it made sense. Like I'm going to have this rambling Ultimate Warrior promo here where it makes sense. You know, he's still rambling, but it makes sense as
Context.
yes, it makes sense to whereas it's a part of the show. You know what I'm saying? Like so he can make it work. Jim Herd cannot make it work at any period of time. So and he didn't know how to, and the staff that he had did not know how to advertise. They didn't know how to market. That's why WCW barely had merch back then, barely. Um,
Yes. So from what I understand, the this era was um, in WCW. You did have a lot of silliness, cross promotion, um,
yes,
but it's when Hogan comes in that you start to see uh, the Faces of Fear, the Dungeon of Doom. You start to see these really gimmicky guys and stables
and
to
it,
try to do the best they could with Hulkamania.
yeah, and it was all guys dressed up to kind of get Hogan, you know, basically to put Hogan over, you know, as if he needed to get put over anymore. He could
Yeah.
just beat Hulk Hogan. But again, that was another example of why it didn't work because the Southern audience did not like Hulk Hogan. You
Nope.
know what I mean? Weren't conditioned to like Hulk Hogan. They were conditioned to like Ric Flair. And that's why it never worked until the NWO came along. Again, you needed a reason to hate Hulk Hogan. That was the perfect reason. Hey, have Hulk come out in black, say he did it for the money. That
Yeah.
seems logical to me. Who knows more about this New York promotion than me? That's logical. You know what I mean? And Bischoff deserves 100% credit for that one. Kevin Sullivan, minor credit as well.
Mhm.
Well, maybe major credit because Kevin knew how to book heels and heat. Um,
But even some of the stuff they were doing with Hogan early on
Hogan,
is
he ultimately had creative control, though. That is my point. So
yeah.
Hogan wasn't going to do anything that would make his character look bad. So I'm sure Hogan had a lot to do with that creative input as well, as far as his character went.
Well, and
So,
it seemed very Hollywood themed, like when he had his handlebar mustache shaved off and he had the brace, um, the neck brace, and he came out. Um, I mean, again, I just keep thinking back to like the Faces of Fear. Some of those promos were just, I mean, mind-boggling. Just worlds and worlds sillier than anything Vince ever did.
yeah, because, you know, again, the only thing Hogan had learned up to that point, while he was very, and Hogan's probably one of the smartest guys in the wrestling business,
For sure.
like you got to think up to that point, he was just riding a wave that was working and he thought it still worked. He didn't have a great pulse grasp on the audience. Like I think Bischoff did by hiring him because he saw, and same what Turner saw, is that worldwide marketing. Hey, we add Hulk Hogan to your brand, it's gonna instantly create eyes on your product, which it did. But
Yeah.
it what you did afterwards that counted. You know what I mean? And that hokey 1980s style in 1994, 95 was not working, you know, but that style was still being rode to death on the other channel too. So both the major promotions didn't know any better at the time is what I'm saying. Wrestling, it was a lot like hair bands. it passed its time. You know, we
Yeah.
were in the land of alternative. People were a little more jaded, a little more pop culturally. We were starting to see reality shows with The Real World and Cops were real
Yeah.
big in the mid '90s. You know, so you had more of a sense of reality on things, and wrestling was not catered that way until an ECW promotion comes along, until we start seeing the NWO, which had traces of reality in it, which
For
that
sure.
that was the original intention, or the Attitude Era, which we're gonna take the gloves off and get creative and every idea, you know. And it took a guy like Steve Austin and The Rock to really put it in the stratosphere like that. You know, and Austin starts off as the ringmaster, you know,
Yeah.
this goof crappy gimmick, you know, that was very dated in 1995. But you know, shave your head, grow a goatee, and you turn into Stone Cold Steve Austin. Whew, you know. And what did we just pass? We passed what, 25 years since that's happened? Both events? Didn't
Yeah.
both events happen like a week away from each other or something like that? I think they were like a week apart.
Oh,
Both.
yeah. King of the Ring, um, with the Austin 316 promo, and then when did Hogan join the NWO? Bash at the
Uh,
Beach.
yeah, July of '96, July 7th, 1990. That's why I was thinking July 7th earlier when I was thinking of our friend Tim's birthday, because I coincided it with Bash at the Beach. Okay, so my mistake. I got my dates screwed up.
You're forgiven.
I, yeah, I'm a horrible friend. Um,
Um,
no, but I for some reason I associated that with Tim's birthday, and I have no idea why. So
I mean, you have so much stuff cataloged and archived in there.
that's no excuse.
Like, um, before, well, yeah. So we're at the NWO, and Stone Cold Steve Austin, and Vince McMahon. Um, I think, in my opinion, one of the most significant events associated with a gimmick was turning Hogan heel. I think that they had kind of flirted with that before, like when he had his mustache shaved off, he was with Jimmy Hart. You know, they'd kind of poked around with that, but to literally kill the golden goose, that was a huge gamble. And that gimmick of training, prayers, vitamins to this, I mean, look at all the stuff that got pelted in the ring when he did that and all of the complaints from parents and everything. And so now at this point, the gimmick in pro wrestling or sports entertainment is going to essentially take over everything else. Gimmick matches, gimmick characters, um, kind of blurring the lines between reality, like you had talked about, and storylines. And so I think what a gimmick is changes almost entirely from that and with the Austin 316 promo.
Yeah,
Like you can no longer just get by on being a decent performer and like the old heel promos used to be people just kind of screaming, into the camera, and that kind of stuff wasn't gonna it just wasn't gonna fly.
yeah, and I was gonna bring up that point too. Is yeah, Austin cut that promo, and it was a revolutionary promo for its time. You know, going back and looking at it in context, but it wasn't. They it wasn't like he set the world on fire overnight. What happened was it led him into his feud with Bret Hart, where he was able to more embellish upon that Stone Cold character, and you know, being in the ring with one of the best wrestlers, period, at that point in time. You know, Bret.
Yep.
He wasn't in the ring with Shawn. You know, being in the ring with Bret was because Bret and Shawn arguably were the top two in the WWF at the
Oh
time,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
getting the rub from Bret and the way Bret Hart put Steve and I'm not saying by wins and losses. I'm saying
Yeah.
just the way he put over Austin's character in the ring helped him greatly to get to 1990, the end of 1997 and early 1998, where he was able to more develop the character side of, you know, because you know, keeping up with Bret move wise, that was impressive enough, but you know, having that that extra little notch, having that character that people can really relate to. I think it's understated, but Brett had a lot to do with getting that Austin character as we know it over and set the table basically for what was to come at the end of 97 and going into 1998. So Austin was ready finally on that level to be Stone Cold Steve Austin, you know?
And
And
their match at Mania 13, I'm obviously a big mark for Brett, but being able to go back now with hindsight and a much greater appreciation for how things like that were, um, I mean, you can put your finger on that and say that might have been, one of the starting moments for the Attitude Era. That right there, swapping roles with Brett and putting, Austin over. That was it was risky in like a different kind of way than like what they did with Hogan in the NWO, but
yeah,
swapping around guys like that, it's incredible that they were able to plan that out, put it into motion, and execute it the way they did.
and it was a culmination of a feud that was going on for 6 months up to that point. You know, you had that great match at Survivor Series, which was Brett's comeback match. Brett's role in the company, while he's still Bret the Hitman Hart, he's not getting the cheers like he used to. You know, and
No,
he's Vince is hearing it. So, they call an audible and they say, hey, like this guy's on the rise. People are starting to like him. He's getting a little buzz. Brett's like, I want to work with this guy, and work with him more. And that WrestleMania match, which really you look at it on paper, it's like submission match with Ken Shamrock as a special referee. Really, they're going back to the well that they did at WrestleMania 11 with him and Bob Backlund. Submission
yeah,
match, right?
yep,
So immediately when I hear submission match, I'm like thinking back to that, and I'm like, oh, that was just brutal. I don't want to watch that, but boy, were you pleasantly surprised when you watched it because it was not what was advertised on paper. You know what
yeah,
I mean? And nobody thought something like that was going to happen. So it felt very organic, but it felt right at that time, and both characters making the switch at the end. That was just the icing on the cake. And that's why I say that may have set up the table for the rest of the year for Stone Cold. Accidental thing with the Owen Hart breaking his neck,
yeah.
that sucked. And that probably, I mean, that took us away from more wrestling matches we could have had for, another 6 months to a year. But really, you look at it character wise, it was one of the best things that ever happened to Steve Austin because he was able to be Stone Cold Steve Austin, that character. He was able to work on that more. I can't do the wrestling thing, but I can work on the Stone Cold Steve Austin thing more.
Yeah.
So,
It was a necessity. He had to cultivate that character, that
right,
gimmick,
right.
and hone it to what was going to work with this new audience.
So whereas Brett intentionally helped him out in the ring, like get him up to that level where he's something good and something to be talked about, he did his job there, right?
Yeah,
Owen unintentionally did his job by injuring him
yeah,
accidentally and really helping create that Stone Cold Cat. So both Hearts are actually to credit, both good and bad when you think
yeah.
about it. So
So there's one more thing I really want to pick your brain about, and then we can uh, start taking a really big kind of sweeping, comprehensive look at all time, best gimmicks, worst gimmicks. I remember very clearly Jim Ross saying that Razor Ramon and Big Daddy Cool Diesel, who are the outsiders in WCW, are going to come back to the World Wrestling Federation. And
yep.
just being, little teenage Chad was just marking out like what, like, and then we have Razor Ramon and Diesel show up, but it's not Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. And doesn't this kind of peel the curtain back a little bit more on gimmicks and things like that, where Vince and Eric Bischoff are kind of sniping at each other, and there was already a court case to have Hall and Nash reel back the type of guys they were portraying on TV. But this is a really telling moment, I think, in wrestling history, where you have, the off-brand Diesel and Razor coming back. What? How does that impact what a gimmick was at that point, and what a gimmick would go on to need to be in the business?
It proved that you can't just throw anybody in that character and have it play off. I don't know where in their mind that could have been a rib on those two, on Kane and Rick Bogner. To be honest, Glenn Jacobs, Rick Bogner, the guys played. Uh, but and I mean, I think they wanted it to be a rib on both Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, and it ended up backfiring horribly.
Yeah.
Really, it wasn't a good look for WWF, in my opinion. It made them look less. And it was much like the Billionaire Ted skits earlier in the year, where
Yeah.
why are you going to go out of your way to put this big production into advertising this promotion that, eh, Bischoff always looked at it as different, Dan, because they knew they were never going to be WWF. WWF looked at it as we're going to be better than them, meaning like at all costs. And that was not a good look, because then that
No.
just made people watch WCW more and check out more of what was happening over there. It made you long. It made you long for the two real guys, to be honest, because I love that Diesel character. It's one of my favorites to this day.
Yeah, that was my dad's favorite wrestler.
Yeah, and Razor was a special kind of guy in the WWF. If you ever got to catch his work there,
Yeah.
and one of the greatest in-ring workers they ever had during that time period. So it just made you long for those two guys more, to be honest. And it's funny because Bischoff stated it on his podcast where it pissed him off that Vince would take the whole "whoa, it's me, we're a small family business" and yada yada yada, and suing WCW because Big Bad Ted's going to come in and buy everybody and create a monopoly and all that nonsense. When Vince did it himself for the last decade and a half, whatever it was, like he
Yeah.
did all these territories out. What it was the wrestler's choice to come to the WWF for the opportunity. Yes, I'll acknowledge that, but come on, man. I mean, Vince knew what he was doing. If he can't buy the territory, he's going to bankrupt the territory. And
Yep.
whether that means like financially bankrupt them or just steal their biggest star, which is also on a financial end, because if that big star is not making that territory money, they're dead in the water, basically, right? Especially if a promoter is very short-sighted and doesn't have many ideas up his sleeve, But
Yeah.
come on, man. I saw it for what it was. More into reading it. It's like, yeah. But
Vince
it ended up,
took all that stuff very personally, I believe.
yeah, and he shouldn't have showed his ass like that. Like, and that just made the company look bad. It made him look bad at that time. Like it made them look spiteful when WWF is supposed to be this industry leader at the time.
Yeah.
It did not. It wasn't a good look. So getting back to my statement, and they tried this earlier in the mid year with if you remember, do you remember the New Rockers when
Yeah.
they brought?
Leaf Cassidy and Marty Jannetty.
Yeah. What did that team make you do?
Miss the old rockers.
Right. So what did Scott Hall and Kevin Nash being portrayed, these two guys being portrayed as Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, made you do? Made you miss Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, right? And
Yep.
it pissed you off more when they didn't deliver Scott Hall and Kevin Nash on Monday Night Raw, right? They're
Yeah.
still on WCW. In fact, they got $800K total more from Ted Turner in hard contracts to stay for another like 2 years or whatever it was based on that. So who was the real winner in that one?
Yeah. Because this was different than like,
It wasn't us.
yeah. Well, and this is a lot different than like the BWO, which is just guys poking fun at the other one. This was nothing in the same idea as that. This was it grabbed a lot of headlines and it grabbed a lot of people's attention, but it seemed really petty.
And the BWO was basically just entertainment. That's all it was, and
Yeah,
it was successful at that, and it still is to this day because it still keeps going. But it's that was just it was a parody. It was meant to be entertaining,
yeah,
and people got it. They did not get that the fake Diesel and the fake Razor thing. Not one bit. They didn't get
yeah,
that. So just like the year previous, they didn't get the evil dentist, Isaac Yankem. Why?
yeah. And I think that that was also a really big moment of what a gimmick was up to that point, kind of dying off. You can't just put, uh, you know, these different guys in the same box and put a Go Faster racing stripe on there and think that, you're going to prove a point. We need, the wrestling business needed people that were going to start blurring that line. That was the only way I think that the industry could reinvent itself and stay relevant was to go towards that reality side of entertainment and just floor it and not look back.
Right. And once they did it, they meaning WWF did it better than WCW. Of course, like I documented, WCW had a lot of other stuff going on behind the scenes too, especially once they became bigger. And then the AOL Time Warner merger went completely through. They had a
Yeah,
lot of bigger stuff going on for them, but which would hinder their growth. I'll take that under consideration. But once WWF got a hold of whatever formula that Bischoff stumbled upon, they took it, they ran with it, like they do with everything else.
yeah,
So
yeah. Like that, just that little moment. Turning JR heel was very interesting, but bringing back Razor and Diesel again, just remember thinking, this, like I said, looking back with hindsight, that's when, if we're going to look at what a gimmick was and what a gimmick is and what it needs to be, that's a funeral for what a gimmick used to be in sports
yeah,
entertainment.
poor and that Rick Bogner was and he was known as Big Titan over in Japan, more specifically FMW, and his career never completely recovered after that. He got booked, he was booked out, overseas, but he never reached any other level. That when once he became the fake Razor, that was it. It was death nail. Thankfully, Glenn Jacobs has recovered a lot better than most.
Yeah,
So and found a gimmick that worked for him,
yeah,
But um, eh, again, that's reliant upon the talent, and the machine has a lot to do with it, but that's also the talent portraying that character. Because Kane could have fell on its ass too in 6 months. So it
yep,
really comes down to the performer.
yeah.
So and how it could positively or negatively affect them. Rick Bogner, I'm not sure how that positively or negatively affected him. It must have negatively affected him because, again, going forward, he could never get steam ever again as
He
Big
will
Time
always be known as Fake Razor.
Razor. Yeah, yeah, which is sad.
Cool. All right. Personal preference. What do you think the what are some of your all-time favorite gimmicks, even if like they don't have a specific context, things that kind of sit with you and just really vibe with you personally, some of your all-time favorite gimmicks.
Okay, Sandman. Always loved his gimmick. The beer drinking brawler. That's great. I love that gimmick even before I started drinking beer regularly. I don't know. There was something about him I as a character I loved because it didn't seem like a far stretch from the truth, to be honest. Stone Cold Steve Austin, similar in vein, but way different, as you know. Love that character. Always loved uh, a big one for me on the masked wrestler side was Ultimo Dragon. I always loved that. that gimmick of Dragon Head, and he had great move set, Dragon Sleeper. I always liked him during the Monday Night War era. Always enjoyed watching him, and he was a great in ring wrestler.
And coming out with all those belts was a great look.
And and that was legit. I won that in that tournament there. Another great gimmick, unmasked, of course, but I also got tapes when it was at its height. It's Conan. We're talking Conan back when he had the dreadlocks, and he was basically like built like a brick shit house, and he was Mexico's equivalent to Hulk Hogan at the time. That version of Conan, I always loved that character. Vampiro, same vein. Always loved that character as well. Sting, in his many variations, always loved Sting's looks over the years. I much prefer Surfer Sting because that's what I grew up on. But the Crow Sting was just as effective. I don't like Tomato Face Sting. I'll agree with
the insane icon.
No, those okay. When he portrayed the Joker, that was fine. A couple other variations were fine. The NWO Wolfpack Sting, I never liked for some reason. I don't know why it was. I just never clicked with me.
And they have fake Sting too.
Yes, who had a great career in Japan. He actually had a long career in Japan as the fake Sting. I was able to tell him about it when I met him in Charlotte last year, and he was very gracious that I did. It's true. He had a huge run as the fake Sting, and he's still very popular over there to this day. Macho Man, Ultimate Warrior. Those were the two gimmicks that really made me fall in love with this crazy business known as pro wrestling. Now Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan are on separate levels, separate categories with me. You know what I mean? This is like comparing my favorite Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, right? Because T2 is on another level as the Running Man, or I have different categorizations for that. But Savage and Ultimate Warrior, I mean, how could you not love those guys when you're 7, 8, 9 years old? That impressionable. They were comic book characters that came to life, basically. And Savage with that voice, Warrior too, with the weird. They were very similar. They had weird promos. They had a lot to look at. Like they really were not that different. Savage was better in the ring.
Well, and both of them had this intensity to them that you just didn't see in other guys at the time.
Right, and go to find out, I mean, they didn't have energy drinks back then, like I'm drinking, but Randy Savage would drink full pots of coffee and get himself hyped up throughout those long television days for promos. And that's where he would just cut promos left and right, whenever the camera was on him. And that made perfect sense. And I guess Ultimate Warrior said with every cup he would sip and drink down, he would just get more and more wound up and start doing the mannerisms right back there, right backstage. So he said that would inspire him to do his character. So, maybe it's not too far fetched to say that's why they're similar. I don't know.
Yeah.
I always love, again, we just mentioned Kevin Nash's Diesel character. I love that character. The original Shawn Michaels Heartbreak Kid character, I'd say 92 to about 90, early 98, right before he left the business, became religious and all that. Oh man, what a great character that was. He was a great heel. Dynamite Kid, I always loved. In-ring worker, one of the best gimmicks, being the original British Bulldog. I always loved his. But on the other hand, I love Davy Boy also. Davy Boy, he was a lot better than people gave him credit for. And Davy Boy had the promo and he had the body, and he was, and he was consistent over the years. He was always consistently in my life in pro wrestling over the years. It's hard not to see it. Big Boss Man, one of your favorites. Mine also. I love that character. Oh man, I can sit here and just list I've already mentioned Flair and Hogan. That's like choosing my favorite child, really. But it really is. Because I love them equally as much. In the world of pro wrestling. I mean, Hogan has to get the edge. Well, you can see my pictures behind me, but Hogan's got to get the edge because really, without Hulk Hogan, I wouldn't be in the pro wrestling.
Yeah.
It's just that simple. I wouldn't. And he had the best babyface character and the best heel character.
Yeah.
And I got to see both. You got to see both. So you got to see all the sides of Hulk Hogan really play out, and during our childhood slash teenage years, and it's just evolved into something else to where now he's an elder statesman. You know what I mean? Polarizing because people either love or hate him, but he's an elder statesman in pro wrestling, much like
Yeah.
Flair.
Yeah.
So Flair is now getting the popularity.
Well,
I
and he's got his retirement match coming up.
Yeah, and now but the thing is, he's more relevant now than he ever was when he was in the game of pro wrestling. People loved him, but it was not like it is now, where rappers embellish upon him, athletes. It's a whole different beast since he's retired initially in 2008, where people have come out of the woodwork and said they've been fans of Flair all along and stuff like that.
Well,
Where
and
I can remember it was a small group of people who actually liked Ric Flair, like when I was a kid. I saw the Great Muta when I was 9. So
well, and if you take a look at, there have been MMA fighters who came out to the Undertaker's uh, entrance with an urn. There
yeah,
was one who came out to Bret Hart's theme, and so the
Shawn,
inspiration, huh?
Shawn Michaels recently at the last UFC event, where all the McMahons were sitting
Yeah.
on one side, you had Tony Khan and Jim Ross on the other. Yeah, I guess one of the fighters came out to HBK, lost, but he came out to Sexy Boy. So
Cool. All right. So, what are some of your all-time least favorite gimmicks?
uh,
Personal preference. It doesn't have to be justified one way or another. Just gimmicks that, put a real sour taste in your mouth.
Dino Bravo. Why was he on my television screen for so long? I don't know why. I know he had a tragic end, but
Yeah.
never really developed a taste for Dino Bravo that much. Even though he was shoved down our throats in the '80s. At first, The Rock, when he was Rocky Maivia, I was not a fan of his at first. I didn't become a fan of his until he became Hollywood Rock in 2003. That's when I really became a Rock fan.
Yeah.
It coincided with that, and then him doing Walking Tall, which made
I
me a
love
Rock.
that movie. I know
Yeah,
it's not very well liked amongst critics. I thought that was a phenomenal retelling of that story.
yeah, and I've seen the original film as well. Yeah, and I I don't know. I just became a fan of his afterwards. So that was one of those that turned around. Um, trying to see guys that I'm least favorite.
Well, so is there anybody that you really disliked with one gimmick, but really appreciated or loved with another, like a full spectrum of, they changed this or this happened and it made a big deal. It was a big deal for you.
I just documented Rock. Okay. Jericho can be in the same boat because I wasn't really digging what he was doing in WCW. I thought it was really goofy for that time. But as Y2J, it was marketed just a slightly different than his time in WCW. And I love the Y2J character. Um, the Miz over, man, I hate to give the Miz credit, but really, how could you not? At first, I just loathed that guy, loathed him. And I was like, why is this guy in our business? He sucks. He's horrible. But he's really, honestly, and if you take a analytic look at it over the last, especially over the last 10 years, he's really upped his game. And now he's to a point where he's one of the best promos and one of the better in ring performers on WWE programming. I'm not saying he's the best, but
Yeah.
he knows what his character is, and he's really turned it around to something else. And you have to acknowledge something like that. I was never really a big Goldberg guy. at any stage of my life. Because really, in my opinion, Goldberg's been done. Nikita Koloff did it, and I thought did it better with more storytelling. Ultimate Warrior did it before. The Road Warriors did it before, where they were just big guys who came in and dominated. You know what I mean? Like that formula has been done since the beginning of time. They did it more recently in recent years with Ryback. You know,
Yeah,
which was um, uh, okay. I liked. He was okay. Um, Another character I didn't like on my screen. That 2004-5 time period where they were just hiring jacked up muscleheads for no reason, and
yeah.
they were stinking up the joint. Most of them were on SmackDown. Some of them made their way on Raw, but your Luther Reigns, your Heidenreichs of the world, because you knew
Tomko.
and I think my distaste for those kind of guys came up because you think by that point I was in my mid 20s, you were in your mid 20s, and we've kind of more developed a sense because we saw a lot more from the time we were 9 to the time we were in our mid 20s, where we can kind of understand it a little bit more and how the business works. And I think that's why I didn't like guys like that on my screen. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
Yeah, so I more had an opinion about it than say when I was 9 years old wondering why Dino Bravo was on my TV every other match. I didn't know why, but uh
Cool. I think for
yeah,
me, it's a much more recent guy, but Roman Reigns. Um, I
yeah,
really was,
he's he turned it around though.
yeah,
His character now is far and beyond way better than what it was. I wish that came out 4 years ago. You know what I mean? 5 years ago, but it did not.
yeah,
Now it's here.
yeah. I
So
was never on the Shield bandwagon, and then when they all went their separate ways, I really dislike Dean Ambrose character, um, but just seeing Roman just packaged and shoved and shoved and shoved onto everybody, and then I came back and he was just so uncharismatic and unoriginal, and it was just the people were not into him, and I was one of those people. But seeing the tribal chief head of the table evolve over the last couple years is especially with the state of the business now, with so many flash in the pan guys coming and going. I think that he is uh, one of the uh, one of the best examples of somebody that was given chicken shit and then later on turned it into chicken salad.
right, and talking about the Shield, I'd say Rollins now, character wise, he's found a character that is connecting, where it's like before it was kind of like he had the in-ring skills. He was a decent promo, easily the most talented one out of the Shield, but he just
Agreed.
had some he just had something missing from his character. You know what I mean? And I think now with this, I don't even know what he is. Is he a cult leader? Is he a game show host? Is he whatever the heck he is now is a character that I very much like watching on
Yes.
television now.
Yeah. I mean, this is like an amorphous blob evolution of the Monday Night Messiah, I think, but
Which I
incredibly
didn't like
talented.
that gimmick. I didn't like that gimmick at all, to be
I didn't
honest.
either.
I liked his character post Shield, where he was that heel champion.
Yeah.
Um, Again, though, something was missing from that, where he was like the corporate champion. Something was missing. I don't know, but yeah, that's Seth Rollins calling you. Um,
All right. Any closing thoughts on gimmicks?
just that gimmicks are they're as old as pro wrestling is, and without them, I think really gimmicks are put there in place for a character to open up the imagination of a pro wrestling fan, and um, without gimmicks, I probably wouldn't be sitting here loving pro wrestling like I have, and I'm sure you wouldn't be either, like
Nope.
I don't think anybody would. Um, but it's, it really, gimmicks on a pure level just spark the imagination, theater, and really make you think the theater of the mind, which pro wrestling is theater of the mind. And you're fully engaged when you see a great gimmick in practice, in place, in ring. You're really engaged in being what being a pure pro wrestling fan is about. So
I like that.
that's my take on it.
Cool.